Hello, my friends. Welcome back. So, magical warfare, or three instances where an act of magic or witchcraft has defended the realm of Britain from foreign invasion. so, last video I made was on Halloween or Samhain and various Celtic or pre-Christian pagan traditions that have fed into that folk holiday, and I talked a bit about witches in that. A few of you have asked me to make more videos on magic and witchcraft, so I'm all too happy to oblige. I'm a folklorist and a storyteller, so I also make a lot of videos on storytelling in the oral tradition and folklore and other little bits about sort of trees and the wheel of the year and the sort of pagan imagination. So if you like that sort of content, then do please give this video a like and a subscribe, and you shall receive more of it. All right, without further ado, 3 times magic has saved Britain from invasion. Instance number 1, the Druids. I'm going to go through these in chronological time order. So, the Roman invasion of Britain. The second invasion, the Claudian invasion, in 43 AD. The Romans landed on the south coast, south of where I am now, and they came directly north. When they got here, where I'm sat, they started building communities. This is a piece of Roman Cirencester, which is the local town over here, which was made in the field behind me, where there's a Roman kiln. So they very much took over this area, the Romans, and they got a foothold of the population, but they knew they had to wipe out the Druids, right? Because the Druids were a big deal in Iron Age Celtic society. They were lawyers, they were mathematicians, they were astronomers, they were incredibly learned, they spoke and wrote Greek, and they also practiced a lot of rituals, both religious and magical. Some people suggest they may have learned this in the lineage from the ancient Greeks, who in turn learned it from the ancient Egyptians, or perhaps it was homegrown magic. We don't really know, but there are historical accounts of the various rites and rituals associated with the Druids. The main place for the Druids was on the island of Anglesey. Anglesey is in North Wales, and some suggest that Druids all over the Celtic world, from Gaul and Ireland or wherever, all came to Anglesey in Wales to receive their training. It was like the sacred Mecca for the Druid caste. So the Romans obviously had to wipe out this power centre of the Druids to maintain control of Britain. So they're marching over to Anglesey, and there are contemporary accounts of Roman soldiers that were then written down not long after this happened by the Roman historian Tacitus. Now, Tacitus is generally considered quite a good historical source of sort of Celtic and Germanic peoples, probably better than Julius Caesar. But this assault on Anglesey was written down, and we have an account of the Druids raining down what appear to be incantations, spells on the approaching Romans. So the Romans were in their ships, in boats, crossing the stretch of water that separates mainland Britain from the sacred island of Anglesey, or Mona. And just as they were crossing, this storm came out of nowhere. Choppy waters, many of the Roman ships were lost. They really struggled to make a landing on Anglesey. And when they did, what a sight beheld them. This is what is described in Tacitus. The Celtic armies there, women dressed all in black, swinging fire wands and braids around with hair like snakes, just screaming and wailing incantations. And also the Druids, male Druids, standing in front of the army, raising their hand up to the sky and, bringing down incantations upon the heads of the Romans. Now, the Celts were experts at psychological warfare, with music and drumming and caresses and headdresses and woad and everything. They were psychological warfare masters that kind of always took the Romans by surprise. But the Celts on Britain were particularly adept and fearsome at this. And in the account, the Romans were petrified by this magical display by these Druids. It had a psychological effect on them. You could almost think of this in terms of sort of hypnotism or mentalism. there was also a physical effect. Many of the Roman soldiers became paralyzed, literally paralyzed, that they couldn't move. It's not clear whether it's by fear or some sort of spell or hypnosis. Some of them even had wounds inflicted on them, even though there was no one there to inflict the wounds. That's what it says in the accounts of Tacitus. I don't know what they suggested. Did they stab themselves with their own gladiuses, or did wounds open up on them? But it looks like an act of ritual magic enacted by these Druids. Suffice to say, it didn't actually work. So the Romans did actually gain a beachhead on Anglesey and stabbed all those Druids to death and burned their sacred groves. And we no longer know much about the ancient religion and craft of Druidry because of the actions of the Romans then, which to me is a great sadness. Obviously, Druidry is a religion now. It's one of the native British religions, but it only probably, in my opinion, bears a passing resemblance to the ancient Druidic magical practices and religion, because we just don't know what that was. So I'm going to skip forward 1,500 years to the next really big time that a supposed act of magic has saved or defended Britain from a foreign invader. So first instance was the Romans. We have a long history of magic through the intervening years. You know, in the Roman Britain, lots of magic being used, usually sort of recovering belongings and things like that. In the Anglo-Saxon period, loads of magic, normally sort of rune-based charms and magic. Also in the Anglo-Saxon period is where we get the word witch from, the Anglo-Saxon word Wicca, which means sorcerer. Incidentally, the area of southwest Britain where I live is also called, was called the Kingdom of the Wicca, which could be a references to the amount of sorcerers that used to live here and still do, my friends. Anyway, enough of that. We get through into the medieval period, and here we have something called ceremonial magic. This is, again, an evolution in the history of magic, going back to the Kabbalah, Jewish magic, or Islamic magical and alchemical systems. Alchemy, which probably goes all the way back to ancient Greek magic, which also probably goes back to ancient Egyptian and Babylonian magic as well. So possibly, you could possibly argue that there was a connection between the magic practiced by the Druids and the religion that was practiced in the Renaissance, including by this guy. This is Dr. John Dee. So this was Queen Elizabeth I's chief advisor. He was also Queen Elizabeth I's official court royal wizard. He was a literal wizard, a magus, a mage, you might call him. So John Dee, a real Renaissance man, a polymath. He had the largest library in Europe at one time, expert in mathematics and the natural sciences, what we just call science today, astrology, astronomy, navigation, but also he practiced magic, ritual ceremonial magic. In this time, in the sort of 1600s, science and magic hadn't diverted like they kind of have today. So you could have a scientist like John Dee was, who also practiced magic. The magic he practiced, you could also describe it as a kind of, you could almost describe it as a kind of shamanism. He made contact with the spirit world, usually by a medium who you could describe as the shaman, a guy called Edward Kelly, who gazed into crystal balls or incense smoke or obsidian mirrors from Mexico, from Aztec Mexico, while Dee made all these diagrams. All this magical paraphernalia is now on display at the British Museum, and it's mind-blowing that this guy used to sit in this darkened room with all these spells with his accomplice Kelly and communicate with angelic and demonic beings and get them to do stuff in the real world. And we have a record of all the sort of spells and communications that Dee had with these so-called angelic and demonic beings. It's fascinating stuff. But in terms of magical defense, the Spanish Armada. So the Spanish Armada, King Philip of Spain sent all his ships over to Protestant England to crush this upstart Protestant Queen Elizabeth once and for all. But as many of us know, this ended in a failure for many reasons. The English ships were very maneuverable. The English used fire ships, but also a great big freak storm scattered the Spanish fleet into the North Sea and destroyed most of it. Now, John Dee wrote a letter to Queen Elizabeth at the time advising her that a storm was on the way. He had foreseen it. So to keep the English ships moored so that the Spanish ships would be scattered by a storm that just so happened to come at just the right moment when the English had released their fire ships. Very, very, very coincidental. Dee also practiced weather magic. So the accounts, and some of these are folkloric rather than historic, but the contemporary accounts suggest that Dee enacted an act of weather magic to summon a storm to scatter the Spanish ships. And it is interesting that he did write to Elizabeth about this. That's in the records. And the storm happened at an amazingly unlucky time for the Spaniards, leading many magically orientated people to suggest that Dee did, in fact, use some piece of ritual weather magic, probably by interceding on behalf of angelic beings so that they could, make the storm. So that is the second instance, an act of magic, in this case ritual, ceremonial, Enochian magic, has been used to defend Britain from attack. The third instance, Britain has been defended by an act of magic. Many acts of magic, actually, in this case, was during the Second World War. This was the time when Britain kind of stood alone against completely Nazi-occupied Europe. The US hadn't gotten involved yet. The Canadians were sending supplies, and these shipping lanes were often hit by U-boats. The Luftwaffe was bombing English cities night after night. But during this time, there was a huge surge in occultism all through the 20th century, really. This guy, Alaister Crowley, was big on the scene here. He's kind of in the same lineage as John Dee all those years earlier. Crowley was a ceremonial magician, but had a bit more of a dark side than Dr. Dee had. Also during this time was the invention of another homegrown British religion, the religion known as Wicca. And I'm sure there are some Wiccans or contemporary pagans out there listening to this. And I know that Wicca has probably gone in different directions in the USA and Canada these days, but it originated with a guy called Gerald Gardner, who allegedly was taught some old techniques, possibly based on the sort of Anglo-Saxon cunning folk kind of magic that's been passed on orally, hand to mouth, ever since. Some people throw shade on that idea. I give it the time of day because I know some people in this part of the world that say that their grandmothers told them this charm and their grandmothers told them this charm. So anyway, witchcraft, kind of a big deal at this time. Now, at the time, Gerald Gardner and his coven of witches in the New Forest, which is on the south coast of England, they did, and this is recorded in one of his books, they did a certain ritual at night. They didn't have a big bonfire because they didn't want the Luftwaffe to see their positions. It was just quite a small, few candles, and they danced around it all night, doing certain incantations and visualizing, projecting a cone of power, a cone of energy to knock those Luftwaffe, those Nazi planes out the sky, the Messerschmitts down. They also projected mental energy into Hitler's mind, saying, "You cannot cross the sea," along with various sort of rituals that went along with that. Obviously, we know the Germans did not cross the sea, and many of these was because of adverse weather conditions, as well as, obviously, the RAF probably had something to do with it as well. But just interesting that this is another instance where allegedly magic was used to defend the realm. Gerald Gardner and his witches weren't the only people doing this. There were other occultists and mediums and spiritualists, such as, say, Diane Fortune, that was operating out of London at the time, and other mediums that would, and this is written about. There's evidence for this. Would provide using clairvoyant abilities. We call this remote viewing now in the sort of parapsychological worldview, but she spotted, she knew, she felt the positions of various U-boats and gave that information to British shipping so they could avoid the U-boats. This is alleged, but it seems that some of her information did actually turn out to be correct. So again, magic being used in the defense of the realm here to spot enemy positions, enemy submarines. This last one is interesting because this is the line between sort of magic and what we might call sort of psychic phenomena or parapsychology. Depending on what your views on magic are, you might think all of this is nonsense, and any talk of storms happening to appear just when a magic ritual is done must be coincidental. That obviously depends on your own worldview. I might make a separate video about that. This video is more for fun. But in terms of parapsychology, there's a lot of evidence done that humans can, in fact, sometimes see into the future or see things that they have no physical way of seeing with their mind. This obviously depends on your worldview again, but a lot of evidence has been done on this. The CIA actually employed psychic spies during the Cold War. There are files on this. There's a popular film, Men Who Stare at Goats, with George Clooney, that's sort of based on this idea. But these files, according to the CIA, they believe it's a phenomena. They've done results of remote viewing with various psychics. One of these was a guy called Inigo Swan that spotted Russian silo depots and submarine construction yards. And when the U-2 spy plane went over, it confirmed what he had seen in his sort of psychic visions. I don't know whether we call this magic. I guess if these phenomena are true, it's science, but it kind of looks like the magic, the occult activities that was being done during the Second World War by these various mediums. So the line sometimes blurs there. So that's the bonus. That's when USA has been defended from Soviet aggression during the Cold War with various psychic individuals, or as we might term them, wizards. Anyway, this video was a bit of fun, my friends, but it's really interesting to delve into the history of magic. It's something I've been interested in a lot. So if you want me to make more videos on sort of the history of magic and sort of the philosophy of magic and some of the folklore and folk customs, let me know in the comments, because then I'll make more of these sorts of videos. Or if you want to hear more storytelling, I'll put a link at the end of this video about a Celtic witch called Ceridwen and her cauldron. Some of you might have seen that before. Finally, my friends, if you like what I'm doing and want to support me financially, you can always do so on Patreon. There is a link in the comments below. See you again soon, my friends. Take it easy.